I'm really pleased now to introduce our first panelist, who's Charlotte Garrett. She's from Canada. She's an educator, provincial coordinator of WHRC Canada chapter, and she's going to be talking to us about the rights of the child, gender identity, and CEDAW Canada, a talk that she was going to give in March at the NGO CSW conference, but was not able to because the New York NGO CSW closed our booth just before she was able to do that. So thank you so much, Charlotte, and over to you.
It's true, yes, I was canceled. WHRC was canceled. Thank you for inviting me back to do this presentation. So the screen that you're seeing now is what I would have started with. So after the Joy Chat conversation, it seems that also during that time there were some links shared to Women's Human Rights Declaration, which I guess wasn't safe enough. So end of that. After that came surveys, help us urge from UN to set more inclusive and effective CSW working methods, which then included this comment by the chair in the newsletter: we must continue, or we must unite to fight those who are consciously creating a divide and conquer strategy within civil society. No one should control our bodies or our destinies. I find that to be a rather ironic statement, considering that the WHRC booth was closed. The survey questions that came out were all about identity. So first, gender identity, no sex questions, and then to race identity, which is now entirely up for grabs. And then included in the newsletter was the Share Your Gender Equality story. That was a call for civil society, which included at Generation Equality, which I will mention in a moment. So the Generation Equality Forum is a civil society-centered global gathering for gender equality in Mexico and France this year. Its actions mainly are transformative actions to achieve immediate and irreversible progress towards gender equality. Big question marks there as to what that will mean, or maybe not. Then in what I was going to talk about, does CEDAW Canada support girls and women? So I also was bringing in at that point the fact that the Declaration for Women's Human Rights campaign is sex-based. It's about the language to support girls and women. So the rights of girls, I would say, beyond the ones that we take for granted, are to speak to her truest experience as she begins to formulate her internal authority, her voice, to be in her being. She is a girl. The sex-based class into which she is born, not assigned. The right to private female sex-based spaces, and to all those spaces created by her mother's mother, and the mothers before her who fought in her name. To the right to an indoctrination-free education, to form an opinion based on evidence-based science, and essentially, importantly, to accurately name an offender using sex-based language. 1981 is when Canada adopted CEDAW, the Committee to Eliminate Discrimination Against Women. Article 1, the term discrimination against women shall mean any distinction, exclusion, or restriction made on the basis of sex. And then followed by the CEDAW implementation came the 1982 Charter of Rights, which is sex-based. So we have CEDAW, sex-based rights, and then we have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So it looked like Canada was on a very good track. But then language shift was under the radar in 2005. The then president of the Canadian Teachers Federation stated, "History has shown that bisexual, gay, lesbian, trans-identified, and two-spirited persons have been among the minority groups who have been harshly treated because of their sexual orientation and gender identity. Of course, this is a false narrative. And at that point, Canada is on its way to its re-education program through education. In 2009 and again in 2012, there are major curriculum changes and legislative changes, which I'm not going to explain all of them, except that it's about creating safe spaces, which of course is absolutely vital, and then followed by curriculum. In Canada, had to give their report in 2015 to CEDAW. So the 8th and 9th periodic reports said that they had doubled to almost 19 million the funding that they were providing to end violence against women and girls, improve women and girls' economic security, encouraging women and girls in leadership and decision making, and to have more women on boards. The 2015 report claims to be implementing the 1982 Charter, and I think in fact they did, which is sex-based rights, and totally essential, of course. But then in 2016 is when the Bill 16 was brought into force, and the Toronto Star said, in a glorious display of Canada at its finest, Bill C-16 will amend the Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code to ban discrimination against people based on gender identity or expression. And the image that came with that editorial was a bathroom, and then the image, "We don't care." So bravo for the Toronto Star. In 2016, all of the provinces and territories had adopted Human Rights Acts for gender and gender expression, -3, which by 2017, they all had amended their codes. And then in 2016, the CEDAW committee came back to Canada with their recommendations based on their 8th and 9th report, and which included advice on how to structure the inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women, which is a crisis in Canada. And to their credit, Canada did address this, but also a stronger regulation of corporations and measures for women's victims' access to justice. So for Indigenous women at home and overseas. And Canada has the largest mining footprint in the world. So they are very disruptive in many, many countries, which creates tremendous problems for families and especially the children. There was no recourse for people to come to court in Canada over the transnational disasters. That has changed. It's just now beginning this year. The numerous recommendations and some scathing comments included the closure of 12 out of 16 Status of Women Canada regional offices, which limited women's access, as well as not mentioned here, but what has occurred also across the country is a closing of many bus services, especially those going to rural areas, which means access to shelters is tremendously limited. So what happened, Status of Women Canada was closed and archived. Not only was it not available, that you had to go and look for the archived website. So Status of Canada was formed 1976, essential to Canada. And those of us who grew up coming into 1976 when this happened, is we welcomed it because it allowed women's voices for the first time in a much more clear and supportive manner across the country. So there's that shut door slammed. And a new agency was formed. Actually, it's a department, a federal department called Women and Gender Equity or Equality Canada. Please note that their number one mandate is to advance equality with respect to sex, sexual orientation, gender identity expression, including all genders, including women. Terrifying. And then what is happening with children's rights then? They're so eroded. So by 2020 and 2021, educational recommendations and curriculum was infiltrating the whole country. And this year, a father was jailed for refusing to play the gender game, didn't want to call his daughter a son. Stats Canada issued their new census, in which they decided to scrap facts for ideology. And then Bill C-10 is now in process, and we call it the Forget About Free Speech Bill. So Canada is captured. So women and gender equality receive 15 million for 76 capacity building projects, which I'm not going to go through in detail. I'll just show you that there are 76, and there's a tremendous amount of money going to especially transgender organizations. So national organizations, and then the Eastern Coast through the Quebec region into Ontario, tremendous amount of resources there. The Prairie region, the Pacific region, which is the West Coast, and the Northern region. The other thing that gender equality did is create a education site. So it's introduction to GBA, and my favorite is you can take this course, and number 2 in the course is moving beyond sex and gender. Isn't that exciting? Moving beyond sex and gender. So this is the Analysis Plus, so it's the new revised edition. And then Canadian Teachers Federation formed a new organization called Femme Lead Femme. And this is CODA here, while the terms women and men are used throughout this document website. The Canadian Teachers Federation understands women to mean people who identify as women. So the status of Women Canada is long gone, and in its place are organizations such as this, where it's about identity. So the language has shifted tremendously from 2016 to now. So just briefly, the efforts in 2016 around language was to reinforce women's rights and to allow access to all women. This did not mean men, it meant women. By 2021, there is a training session happening in Toronto where the activities are focused around identity and intersectionality, intersectionality, not sex-based rights at all. Then if we just look at what is actually happening in Canada, the violence is tremendous, and every 2.5 days, a woman or a girl is murdered. And this isn't new. The number has remained relatively stable over the last number of years. We don't have the 2021 facts yet, but as you can see, it's a fairly stable horror story. The violence, if we just look at the facts, 67% of Canadians know a woman who has experienced physical or sexual abuse. That number is actually higher. I don't know how they got that 67%. However, I know for actually a woman who was murdered because her husband didn't like the fact that she wanted a divorce. He smothered her with a pillow. I know so many women who have been abused. 6 times Indigenous women are killed at 6 times the rate of non-Indigenous women. And this is the part that bothers me tremendously, is 6,000 women and children sleep in shelters on any given night because it isn't safe at home. But now we know that shelters will also accommodate men. And so now women are feeling not just unsafe at home, but what happens when they go to a shelter and they no longer feel safe there. In fact, women have left shelters in Canada because they didn't agree and they were asked to leave, not the men, the women. So the 3 areas that CEDAW Canada pledged to focus upon was ending violence against women and girls. We see that has not happened. Improving women's and girls' economic security and prosperity. No. Encouraging women and girls in leadership and decision-making roles. Well, the area that especially took that on was the Canadian Teachers Federation for women who identify as, or men who identify as women, are being assisted in leadership roles. And then finally, I want to say that what has happened is that the language change is so profound that the verb to be has been deconstructed and in wokeness decolonized, so that I am a girl, well, maybe, maybe not. So material reality is destabilized. The body mind is severely disturbed at the same time as the world is destabilized. And 80,000 displaced people, 80 million and 26 million refugees. Now it was just, I think 5 years ago, 65 million displaced people. So the numbers are just exploding with crises around the world. And this includes, of course, children.